On today's Locked On Bucks, we begin our look into the offseason. Free agency officially begins, and it gets off to quite a slow start. So we sift through what we've seen so far, what we think is going to happen, as everything seems to be hanging on Paul George. So we'll get into that coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Frank Madden, as we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And speaking of getting started, Frank, the free agency period began Sunday afternoon.
Did it start? Okay.
So that was kind of the question is how much are we going to see? And I know Camille and I talked about this last week too, but you kind of got the sense this could be like 2016 all over again when you think about there's not much out there in this free agency class, but there's a handful of teams that were in on Paul George. So it's all going to come down to him. So I think Saturday was the first checkpoint where you wanted to see, okay, does he opt in? Because I would assume if he does, that means there's a trade in the works, and that opens up other teams that he can go to. He declined the player option. So then you thought, well, it's probably down to the Magic, the Sixers, or staying in LA. But just like we saw with Kevin Durant in 2016, I think the Gordon Hayward summer was the same thing as well. They didn't pick their teams until the 4th of July, so a couple of days into it. And in the meantime, you would see smaller scale signings of teams that knew, like, hey, we're not even in on this, so we don't have that domino effect. Everyone else, though, whether they were in on that player or they were in on somebody else that was waiting on those teams, was just kind of stuck in this holding pattern. And I don't know if it's going to be days, but it seems like that's what most of Sunday was.
Yeah, I mean, my whole mindset coming into this was, and I think Camille and I talked about it on draft night. As far as expectations of things happening, especially around the Bucks, right? And we've talked about it, right? I mean, Bobby and Pat were available at the deadline. Nothing happened, right? Now, there were obviously suggestions that, was there a Grant Williams trade possibility? Not to say that there was no chance of anything happening, or that, the Bucks were wedded to keeping those guys, till the end of time. But that was a natural time if you were going to see a deal to potentially see one then. When they didn't happen, I think it said something about their value. Leading up to the draft, you have a unique situation where you actually have two draft picks that should have some appeal, and especially with someone like Pat, who I think his value from a contractual standpoint is negative at this point. Not wildly negative, but nobody's banging down your door to get Pat Connaughton for $9 million a year for the next 2 years. And so when, again, we don't see anything happen and we see them take young players with those two draft picks, I think that's told you that there's probably not much going on here as far as, interest in Pat Connaughton and Bobby Portis. And, again, is something going to change that? Is there going to be some event that triggers a change? It's almost like those probability, the kind of like the win probability thing, like the trade probability curve for Pat and Bobby, I think should have gone up at the time of leading right up to the draft. And then when they don't get traded, go down pretty precipitously. So I know people are kind of, it seems like a lot of fans are kind of sitting around waiting to see the Woj bomb, the Shams bomb of those guys getting moved, because people just want to see something happen. But again, the point is not to just trade guys just to move them, especially if the market is not going to support giving you, useful players back. And again, like you can argue, like, well, how useful were those guys in the playoffs, blah, blah, blah. But, obviously Bobby Portis is, I'd say, certainly a useful regular season player for whatever, challenges he may have in the postseason. And Pat, obviously this year, not as much, but, even last year against Miami, like he was actually had a great series against the Heat, which kind of got lost to history given kind of what happened in that series. So again, I don't think the Bucks want to just give those guys away. Someone was asking me about like stretching Pat. You could stretch him over 5 years, and I think you'd owe basically like 3.9 million or so a year rather than the 9.4 you owe him over the next 2 years. Problem is, like, you then also have to sign somebody, so that knocks basically $2 million off the theoretical benefit of that. So like net, it's like, maybe there's like $3.5 million of effective benefit from stretching Pat Connaughton. That's not going to get you under the second apron. That's not going to get you or the taxpayer mid-level or something like that. So the upside is not high to do something with Pat unless there's a trade to be had. And so I think, my kind of thinking coming into this start of free agency was, all right, you have only minimums to offer. And granted, I think the Bucks, especially with that fifth starter role, can offer a very appealing role to someone willing to take the minimum. Chris Dunn, I think, is probably like, the top of a lot of people's lists. A few other guys could be appealing. Again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you like Josh Okogie or Dennis Smith Jr. is going to like change your life or, put the Bucks in the driver's seat for the Eastern Conference or something. But I think there's arguments for why guys like that could be a very appealing, is even if they're not the fifth starters, is giving you depth in the backcourt, giving you a defensive edge you didn't have last year. But the flip side is you're still offering minimums, and the Bucks have tried to do 1 year minimums because there's a further cap benefit to doing a 1 year minimum rather than a 2 year minimum. Like Phoenix last year did 1+1s, which carry a bigger cap number, bigger tax hit than just doing straight 1 year veteran salaries. Again, like won't kind of bother people with the why of that. But obviously, if you're a guy taking a minimum, you'd rather have a 1+1, because worst case scenario, if your ACL gets torn or something, then you can always just
a second year.
Yeah, and you got some coverage. And the Bucks have tried again to minimize even that, right? Malik Beasley had a 1 year deal. He didn't have a 1+1. So again, like the idea that like, free agency starts and you're going to have like people banging down your door and saying like the Bucks have signed Chris Dunn to a 1 year minimum contract. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. Like those guys should probably shop around a little bit and see what else is out there. See how things play out. Maybe some team has money available and throws them a bone with something more than the minimum, maybe something closer to the taxpayer mid-level, something like that, right? So the Bucks have to, I think, by definition, if they're going to get somebody good, it's probably not somebody that is going to take that deal at 5 o'clock or whatever at the start of free agency. You probably need to wait, like a day or two. I think Malik Beasley, signed on the day 4, I believe. Last year.
Yeah, I think it was like July. It might have been the 4th of July too. It was a couple of days into it. Where, to your point, you wait to see, is there anything out there? Is there a taxpayer mid-level or a mid-level for me? No. Okay, right. Let's start looking at the teams that are offering the minimum.
Yeah. So, again, long story short, I think not at all surprising that there's been no Pat or Bobby trade. I think one question that's been coming up a lot, and it's amazing how many people I've been DMing with, like other kind of like Bucks cap nerds, like, Van Fias was on the pod last week, and like Van and I've been exchanging a lot of messages. Like so many of us are like, even us like nerds who have like spent so much time looking at this are like still trying to parse a little bit like, okay, so what exactly can the Bucks do with like salary aggregation? As best as I can understand it, just because it's been coming up a lot, I think the Bucks are technically right now under the second apron, but once they sign essentially like, up to 14 or 15 guys, they will definitely be over. I think, my projection, if they fill out the roster to 15 with 1 year minimums, they'll be around like 6.7 million over the second apron. So I think basically if they wanted to do a salary aggregating trade, they would, again, my understanding is that would trigger the second apron as a hard cap.
Yeah.
So basically, like if you do this, you have to then stay under the second apron for the rest of the
for
season.
the year. Yeah.
Right. Which like flat out isn't feasible right now. If you just took even money back in an aggregating trade,
Yeah.
wouldn't be feasible because you still have to add dudes and you'd be over the second apron. So the idea that like you're going to do an aggregating trade where you add, Pat and Bobby, but then you take back, like something that would theoretically like fill the bill of this would be like Pat and Bobby for Dorian Finney-Smith, who makes a little bit more than Bobby, so you couldn't trade him straight up because the Bucks can't take back more than 100%. But it's like, what is the motivation here for like,
Brooklyn?
For Brooklyn to do a deal like that? Like, I mean, again, like I think I believe a trade like that theoretically, and again, I don't know Brooklyn's cap situation, but like if that would technically work from the Bucks perspective because you would save off a fair amount of money, like $6-7 million bucks.
Yeah.
But again, it's just like what are the like versions of that type of deal that could actually happen? And I'm very skeptical, and I think in general, I think the fact that they use both of those for the first round pick, the second round pick, especially the first round pick, given the cap hit that had, I think to me that tells me that they're going to be okay. They're kind of resigned if they have to being over the second apron,
bringing it,
And then the main thing is then they want to not be in the second apron next year because if you hit it a third time in 5 years and it starts doing cap freezing and things like that. But the second apron is also going to go up by 10% next year when the TV money comes, et cetera. And I think they're going to have a much easier time dodging the second apron a year from now. But this year it's going to be very difficult. So, all told, basically, I'm not saying that you have to be happy about this as a fan because I'm sure people want to see this team improved because they clearly need, I think, better defense in the backcourt, more athleticism, blah, 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 the stuff we've been talking about for a while. But how they exactly do that, I mean, I don't think there's been a lot of like John Horst slander on my timeline today. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you John Horst is like the perfect GM or something, but there's not a ton that they can do. And again, you can say that that's like part of, their own making because of decisions made previously. But right now, there's not, I don't think like some home run easy trade that again really improves the team. And again, I think probably what we'll talk about here on this pod is like we keep kind of coming back to the idea like, well, would you be willing to trade Brook Lopez because he seems like the guy who was not previously on the market, who they would least entertain that, and who would have notably more value. But the flip side being, he's also I think much harder to replace than Pat Connaughton or Bobby Portis.
I mean, I don't know if you're a golfer, Frank, but this whole offseason for the Bucks, what they have, it's basically like if you show up to the golf course to play your round and you see, oh, I just have a driver and a putter in my bag. So like these are the only two things I can do. Everything in between, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And that's basically the cap situation that the Bucks are in. They could pull off some type of trade if you want to talk yourself into maybe it's time to trade Chris Middleton, or as we mentioned, Brook Lopez, with those types of contracts, or it's just the minimums because everything in the middle, it's basically out the window, especially as more days go by from the draft and into free agency too, without making those types of moves where you would look to trade one of those contracts and add the very, very limited sweeteners that the Bucks had coming into this offseason. And, even just something like that entirely hypothetical Brooklyn trade that you mentioned. I mean, the other piece to it is, you're sending out two players. So you still have to fill out your own roster and you'd have to try to stay under that, assuming you're allowed to do it. You would definitely have to stay under that second apron, but now it's one more guy that you're going to have to add on the veteran minimum to round out that roster. So that's what makes this offseason all the more tough for the Bucks.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I would be very wary of making a Brook Lopez trade just to make a Brook Lopez trade.
Right.
I know there's obviously a population of people out there who are like, oh, whatever, sign Bismack Biyombo and like because he's can sprint up and down the floor faster than Brook, therefore he must be better defensively. I'm obviously not one of those. I know you're not one of those, but I do think, and this I think is an important thing, and this is something I've been saying, right? I think the appeal of trading Brook is that you can potentially disaggregate his $23 million salary into a couple of players who I wouldn't expect, any of the players you would trade for to be individually better than Brook Lopez.
Yeah.
The selling point would be, could they be more versatile than Brook Lopez, especially in a playoff setting? Well, that would obviously be part of the selling point. Like the on-off numbers with Brook, the last two first-round playoff exits have been bad. They've been a lot better with him off the floor, in spite of the fact that offensively he's been like gangbusters. Like
Very good,
against the Heat, against the Pacers, he scored a ton and very efficiently. Like Brook Lopez always makes shots in the playoffs. Like give Brook his flowers on that front, but again, there's matchups where it's just not going to be as favorable for him. And certainly, like if he's doesn't have Giannis out there and you're having to play him more because Giannis is hurt, i.e., the last two postseasons, then that's going to exacerbate the challenges with Brook. But I do think there are, examples that at least I would entertain. The idea of trading him for call it two players that are cheaper, or I don't know, maybe three players, but call it two players who are rotation worthy. And again, individually, probably neither of them is as well-rounded in terms of offense, defense. Nobody that is going to go out and finish second in defensive player of the year as Brook. As a reminder, he's only 13 months removed or whatever it is from finish second in defensive player of the year. You're not going to get a guy of that caliber, but and obviously we can chat through like some of the, I don't know, hypotheticals of like what some of those deals might look like, but maybe there's a move that either disaggregates him into two rotation players to give you more depth and maybe some more defensive versatility, maybe younger, right? Pretty much by definition, you're going to get younger if you trade Brook. But even if you don't maybe take back two guys, maybe you take back one guy or one guy who's, cheaper and then another guy who's also pretty cheap. And then maybe that is what, reduces your salary and gives you some more flexibility. Although again, I would always kind of caution as well, like if you're doing like a major salary dump just to be able to aggregate salaries, then you have to also think about like, what do you have left at that point to actually then do salary aggregating moves. And again, all things being equal, like, yeah, I definitely would want to be able to aggregate salaries because you never know on the margin where like throwing in an extra, margin on over here or whatever it is might be, like that can be helpful. But again, like being able to aggregate is in and of itself not the end goal, right? It's a tool to be able to make the team better, and you can't kind of do something overly destructive just to have that as an option, because again, there's so few kind of tools you have to make moves. And again, I think if you want to criticize the draft picks, I think it's a lot less if you're mad about the draft picks. To me, like if you're doing it through the lens of like you have to compete now, you have your window, I think the argument is much more that you should have found ways to trade those picks either for players or kick the can down the road, so then you can make a move leading up to the deadline with picks. And less about like, well, I wanted an older player versus the young guys that you got, because again, like I don't know, I feel like the talent eye that you have to have for the pick swamps the like experience piece of it. Like I think if you pick a good player, you're much more likely to get something even very early on from that player if they're young than if you just like pick some average guy that just happens to be 23 years old, right? Like again, like picking somebody who's experienced just for the sake of being experienced, like I think that you can kind of easily fall into a trap. But as we said last week as well, like the Bucks have not shown like have not won the benefit of the doubt, right? I mean, DJ Wilson was, had played 3 years of college. Was DJ Wilson the immediate impact guy that people hope for? No, absolutely not, right? Malcolm Brogdon's really kind of like probably the exception in terms of guys who were like really experienced college players who were older. And then that did come in and really were able to make an instant impact. But for the most part, like whether the Bucks have picked young, old, whatever over the past, post Giannis years, pretty much nobody has really kind of come through. So I don't know. It's kind of a nuanced thing, but again, people anchor on the age because that's the easiest thing to see, right? The hard part is figuring out like, well, who's actually ever going to figure out how to play NBA basketball. That's unfortunately the part we just have to sit back and wait on.
A couple other things I do want to get to on Brook Lopez, because it seems like that's really the only thing you have left in the short term. I as we mentioned, the Bobby Portis, if he is traded, to me, that seems like that's something that'll happen later into the offseason in the summer when teams start to strike out, and we can rekindle these talks with the Bucks. But there's some interesting things to the Brook Lopez component. You mentioned a few of them, but I want to get into a couple other things with Brook and this Bucks team going forward. We'll do that after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, I love sports so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. So there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Frank, before we started recording too, we kind of tried to take a look at realistically what's out there that would make sense. As you mentioned, the hypothetical, what if you did with the Nets? But again, hey, there's no interest in the Brooklyn Nets for doing this. So looking at some of the teams that we saw come out in a few various reports of, hey, this team would be interested in Brook Lopez. There are a couple that stood out, and I think the one that's most interesting, because we've seen it now from a few reporters today or Sunday as free agency begins, and that's the report that's out there that I think this was one of the teams we heard showing an interest a week or so ago, that the Lakers are very interested in reacquiring Brook Lopez, which that team is fully into. We got to win now because we have LeBron James for who knows how much longer. That would be a terrifying front court defensively when you got Anthony Davis's versatility and Brook Lopez as a rim protector. So I can talk myself into the fit for the Lakers here, but I think the tricky part is one of the things that you were mentioning towards the end there when we talked about any potential Brook Lopez trade. When you look at the roster of the Lakers here, and here's the other piece. I think two teams to point out of potential interest in Brook Lopez: the Lakers and the Mavericks. There are also two teams that are linked to Klay Thompson, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be a straight up signing. It's going to be a sign and trade with Klay Thompson leaving the Warriors. So you have to factor that in as well they could lose assets here. I just don't see the perfect fit with Lakers personnel coming back to the Bucks. And that's ultimately going to be the toughest part of any Brook Lopez trade. As we've mentioned, the value that he does bring, but I just don't know what trade is out there involving Brook Lopez that makes you better. It might make you different and it give you versatility, but let's just say the Houston Rockets, another team that were said to have shown interest obviously last year, but now this summer again. For Houston, we've talked through it before. What would make sense for both sides probably would be something that included Steven Adams and another one of those young guys. Tari Eason, I know, is a name that Bucks fans have kicked around a lot. But let's say you do that trade. Steven Adams he's certainly not going to be closing for you in those types of minutes. So I'm not sure how much you totally addressed your playing different, adding more versatility. I don't know that your front court would be Tari Eason and Giannis as your 4 and 5 closing there. And that's ultimately going to be the biggest challenge here is, sure, you could add some more versatility, but I don't know what you're going to do for the rest of those moments to get to the end of those games where you want that versatility.
Yeah, I mean, and I think easy to overlook challenge with moving either Brook or Bobby is the durability those guys have had. Really outside of the Brook back injury year.
Yeah.
Other than that, Brook pretty much, shows up to work every night. In the last 2 years, his minutes have been the highest that they've been during his Bucks tenure, which not ideal probably like for his longevity, but so far obviously he's held up those last couple of years. I think the Houston deal, is kind of the reverse side of the durability coin.
Yeah.
Obviously with Steven Adams, like he's had some concerning injury issues, missed all of last year with a knee injury. Not a Brook Lopez in terms of durability for sure. Eason's also had kind of some, and again, I don't know all the depths of kind of what like the leg injury issues he's had, but he's also had some durability problems. I think you've got 2 years I think left on his rookie contract at least,
Yes.
so you've got some team control. But I think I would definitely think long and hard about that option, just because I think Eason is unique and interesting enough. And I think if you are rolling the dice on a guy on a move like that, I think you have to figure out ways to get Tari Eason on the floor, and he's not going to be, your starting shooting guard. So you have to figure out ways to lean more into Giannis at the 5 type of lineups, which, I think we've all kind of tried to make people aware that Giannis does not want to be a starting 5 for sure. And his interest in, banging down low as a 5 for extended periods probably is not super high, especially coming off 2 straight years where he wasn't healthy in the playoffs. But certainly Steven Adams might be a guy that he would appreciate just from just like a physical bodyguard type perspective. Doesn't obviously stretch the floor like Brook does, but his rebounding, his boxing out is tremendous, right? I think one of the guys that could actually be an upgrade on Brook, who again doesn't grab a lot of rebounds himself, but is great at boxing out and giving Giannis room to grab rebounds. But yeah, and I think to be clear too, I mean, I've heard a few people say like, well, Giannis, like there aren't that many like low post centers. Like, what is he really that worried about? To me, it's not really like the post ups. It's just like having night to night. Like if Steven Adams type guys are the ones that you have to box out, it's exhausting, like,
I mean, look, there's one team that's not going away with this offseason in Philadelphia that you got to worry about Joel Embiid. You don't want Giannis defending Joel Embiid.
Right. I mean, you're going to have to double constantly, right? Or just have him fronting constantly. And that's exhausting too, right? Like if you're putting him in that
it's
role.
not only that, but it just, to be able to use Giannis, especially assuming the Bucks can improve their perimeter defense in the offseason here, but to be able to use Giannis there as the weak side helper and to come over as he's our second rim protector is what makes him even more valuable defensively. And you're taking that away. That I know if you are able to find something that fits where you can get an athletic 4, I still think, and we're aligned here, you would love to find some type of cheap center that can just eat up those center minutes. So that can be your closing lineup. Is Giannis is your rim protector and you have athletic switchability next to him. But I mean, easier said than done with what's out there this summer.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to trade Brook Lopez, I think you would need to do it like now, because the number of guys, like for one, let's say Steven Adams, it's like a Steven Adams, Eason type deal, right? And I'm sure they would not want to give up Eason. They'd say like, look at Jayshawn Tate. Don't you like Jayshawn Tate? Like, not really. Like I've had my phases where I appreciated Jayshawn Tate, but he's pretty much not gotten better. They just picked up his team option. He makes more money than Tari Eason too. But I think if you were trading Brook, right, like you look at some of these teams, like the Lakers, for instance, like I guess the Lakers would probably try to sell you on like Rui Hachimura and his $17 million a year. He's a more versatile defender, and look at his 3-point shooting in the playoffs. Like, yeah, but I don't know. I mean, like Rui's like fine, but like again, like he's not starting at center for you. So like he's basically a Bobby replacement, not a Brook replacement. And so they would probably say like, well, Jackson Hayes just opted into his contract. Here, you can have him. He's a center. And then you'd say, well, Jackson Hayes is also a guy that, has bounced around because he just kind of is not really very smart and just kind of an athlete running around out there. And, like they could throw Cam Reddish, who just opted into his player option for a minimum, which is also kind of like tells you something about his market. So like, yeah, they could throw like some bodies at you, but again, like the Lakers, like, are they some great trade partner? Like Jared Vanderbilt, yeah, interesting player, but like, are you starting Jared Vanderbilt at the 2? Even though he's versatile, he's very large and can't shoot. Um, so the Lakers are definitely an imperfect target, but it is at least noteworthy that they are interested in Brook. I think Orlando has been a team that I've kind of looked at sort of throughout the summer as a potential landing spot, in part because if Brook has to leave, I would want him to be in the Magic Kingdom. Shout out to Brook. They have Willie Willie Cauley-Stein. No, they have Wendell Carter Jr., who I don't think Wendell Carter Jr. is, like the missing piece for the Milwaukee Bucks, but he's good. He can shoot an open three. He's more mobile defensively, but he's also a big guy. And he's younger and cheaper. So, Wendell Carter Jr. plus something, potentially allowing you to get off some money. They have cap space. So again, it could be a salary dump that also gets you cheaper and younger. Would I entertain that? Like, I guess I would entertain it, but it would pain me. I don't think you're better next year for it, as it were. So, but it's difficult. And then Dallas was thrown around. Like Dallas was listed as like a team that might be interested.
Yeah.
And I guess the logic there might be just that Gafford and Lively are kind of very similar stylistically. So would you want a veteran who can play differently and stretch out the floor? Notwithstanding Derek Lively making that one random 3-pointer in the finals, like that's obviously not his game. So could they have interest in Brook? Like I guess. And so like what could that type of deal look like? Gafford makes 13, 14, kind of like a similar like to the Wendell Carter Jr. thing. Like basically you get a guy who's a fair bit cheaper, younger. Gafford is obviously not a shooter at all. But a solid rim protector. And then what else can Dallas give you on top of that? They've got a number of kind of random pieces, right, that they could throw in, like Dante Exum, Be Still My Heart, obviously. I think would be actually a pretty good fit in Milwaukee. But again, it's like, what are you really trying to do, right? Quentin Grimes was just on the way. I've been very intrigued by Quentin Grimes. I think he'd be a great fit in Milwaukee, but concerns about his knee and his health and why the Pistons were willing to just give up on him for a pretty low price, here with Dallas. So again, like I think with Brook, at least there are options that I would at least consider. But again, kind of returning to my point, like, if you are doing a deal where you do not get back your starting center, and you're expecting to get one in free agency, like the number of appealing centers in free agency is like very, very short. I mean, to me, it's like Goga Batadze, I guess, and like Precious
Daniel
Achua.
Tice. Yeah, Precious Achua, but you're not going to get any floor spacing there. But he can defend some on the perimeter.
But those guys aren't signing if Brook Lopez and Bobby Portis are here, right? Like they're not going to look at Milwaukee and be like, sign me up.
Big opportunity for me.
Yeah, like I want to be the fourth big. It's like, no, like if you traded and you had a big hole at center, like that would be bad. But I guess you could maybe talk those guys into like, hey, look at this great opportunity. But again, then they're not just going to give you Brook Lopez production, which again, I don't know. Part of me is like, it kind of also makes me look back at Brook's tenure here and kind of like, especially offensively, wish that like they had more consistently leveraged some of Brook's interior scoring ability. But so it goes, right? Like if Brook is around, then hopefully that may be something that Doc can lean on a little bit more than maybe we've seen in the past. But so yeah, I think there's some Brook options there, and that really is probably, I think if there is going to be a big move and something that really shakes things up, I think then that would be the more obvious path to take. But again, like, are you making a move just to make a move? Or is it really making you better? That we would have to kind of wait and see. I know there's people who would be happy to see Brook go just to, say like, drop defense, like something, but
got to get younger.
Yeah. I mean, getting younger is important. Look, although by the same token,
clear,
like you're stuck with
they do
Cam
have
Miller
to get
too.
younger. Yeah. But how you do it is the big piece of it. There's one other thing I do want to get into briefly here with Brook Lopez, and then we mentioned what's going on in the rest of the East as free agency begins here. We'll take a look at that coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. All right, so like the last thing to put a bow on the Brook Lopez conversation here, I mentioned this somewhere else. I don't remember if it was with Camille last week or not, but how much value so to be clear, there's a lot of value having Brook on your team and on the floor. But you know, I, I know you said if you're going to do it, the time is now, but also how much value is there to carry him into the season as a $23 million expiring contract that if it gets to the point of, hey, we got to do something, that's a pretty big chip to dangle at the trade deadline. And then also, as you mentioned, the cap going up 10% next year is going to give you a lot of help, or at least moderate help in your relation to the second apron. But then if Brook Lopez moves on, too, obviously you want some type of asset management. But if you take 23 million off the books, that helps you even more. So that's where I'm kind of stuck of between those two things and everything we've gone through before of I just don't really see the trade that's out there where you're making yourself better trading Brook Lopez. It kind of seems like it would be a deal where you send out $1 and you get back 3/4.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to really buy into. I think that's definitely true from a regular season standpoint. Factoring in again, just in the regular season, like rim protection and size. Like people always, I think, like people, especially over the last decade with switching and things like that, like people, I think, began to sleep on the inherent value of just being like big and protecting
Yeah.
the rim in terms of regular season defensive success. And I think again, like there's a reason why we kind of always keep coming back to this, and there's a reason why like most teams do not start, like 6'9", just pure switch centers. Like Bam Adebayo types are just like the exception to the rule. And for the most part, what is successful, and it's been this way for a long time, is just having big guys that can stop you from getting layups, right? And whether you talk about Boston, New York and their size, and what that's meant, not just in terms of rim protection, but rebounding. Dallas, how much their season turned around when they essentially doubled the number of big centers that they could throw from a rim running perspective. Again, I think that's just something that is here to stay. And now, again, I think there is an interesting question. I think there's been some debate about like, do the Bucks really need a floor stretching center, or can they get away with a rim running big man in a way that we kind of presumed that they would not want to even try with Giannis, just from a spacing perspective. Look, I think with Giannis, you're always going to be better being able to put 4 shooters around him versus being forced to put a big guy in the dunker spot because that guy can't shoot. We talked a few years ago about how they began putting, a lot of times guards in the dunker spot, because then that puts a smaller defender as kind of the rotating help guy when Giannis is driving. If you've got Daniel Gafford or whoever sitting in the dunker spot, though, that guy's being guarded by a center. So then Giannis is driving at, not just whoever is guarding him, who's probably like a 4, maybe a 3, but also then having that center, being able to rotate over and challenge him at the rim. So again, it could still work. I'm sure the Bucks can scheme around that. Like, I'm not going to say it's like, Giannis just can't play with one non-shooter. Giannis is a problem solver. I'm sure they could figure out, but like, does that optimize, your offense? I don't think it optimizes your offense.
Yeah.
But it's something kind of worth monitoring. I mean, we saw from Giannis, like he and Brook, I thought, had great chemistry, with Brook flashing to the rim and being a big target around the basket, not just a guy standing, 27 feet from the basket, waiting for kickouts to shoot threes from. I thought that was kind of one of the wrinkles that was always interesting, was when Brook actually did try to be a target for Giannis around the basket. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it's the one kind of big, to me, it's the big, I said it was the big existential question coming in the offseason. Like, do the Bucks entertain trading Brook Lopez as the big change that they might make. And I think that's still the case, especially with kind of some of these other doors closing, and especially with the draft picks not being moved for help and not being used to, make the Bobby Portis and Pat Connaughton trades happen that obviously everybody has sort of been like waiting for. But, I think there's unfortunately good reasons why those haven't happened.
As we start to wrap things up here, we kind of hinted at it when we said, I mean, Philadelphia's not going away. You got to contend with Joel Embiid, so you'd like to have some size in terms of a traditional big there. But I think it was in the back of all of our minds. I was always under the assumption this was just the world's strangest game of chicken, and Paul George was eventually going to end up back in Los Angeles. And now it certainly appears he's headed to the 76ers, which I don't think is great news for the Bucks and the Eastern Conference, as Philly's also added Daryl Morey favorite Eric Gordon on the vet minimum, and they still have some more room to do some things. One of the names we did not mention in terms of who else could you add, not a traditional big per se, but Nick Batum is not going to be back in Philadelphia, and I think he'd fit nicely with the Bucks, but it's also, hey, would you be interested in taking a vet minimum here when I'm sure he's got those offers elsewhere and possibly more? But Philadelphia seems like it's going to be maybe as early as Monday that we hear Paul George is headed there. And then the prospects of knowing the Celtics have built up what they have. Kristaps Porzingis sounds like he's going to miss some time to start the season, but that's still obviously a very good team. And a 76ers team that would have a trio of Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, and Paul George, and the New York Knicks adding Mikal Bridges. I mean, that's the other tricky part about this offseason for the Bucks. And when we said there's very limited things they could do, but I think we've seen things flip in that the Western Conference is where we've seen on day one of free agency, 3 teams or so start to take a step backwards, it seems. And now the East, I mentioned Mikal Bridges, his addition in New York, and Paul George, we think, headed to Philly. I'm not saying it's fully, hey, the East is better than the West, but we're seeing teams get better in the East.
Yeah, I mean, a year ago, right, it was like, oh, Boston and Milwaukee, like clear top 2 in the East, right? No one's going to be saying that coming into this season. I think it's going to be very fashionable. I mean, we'll see, again, like the Paul George thing, I mean, it hasn't even been like officially broken, but it's more just a, process of elimination, right? Like, well, he's not going back to LA and Orlando. Like, can they even make the offer? Like, maybe, but like, is he really going to go to Orlando over Philly? I mean, again, let's just assume the worst, that he goes to the Sixers.
I do, just real quick, I do think Orlando still has close to the max for Paul George, but they have to round out their roster is the other tricky part. So it would be Paul George and then vet minimums the rest of the way.
Well, and they obviously want to throw everything they can to get Brook Lopez too, right, Justin? So yeah, I mean, I would say it's a bad, holistically, it's been a bad, week for the Milwaukee Bucks 2025 title chances, right? Draft night, both through the Bucks in action, right? Taking first and second rounders who are obviously not going to have an impact on next year's team. We're really, again, like, I don't think anybody that they were going to pick was going to make me think that, like, oh, like this really helps them win a championship next year, right? Like, to be clear, I think that would have been pretty naive. But obviously New York, I'm very curious what happens with Isaiah Hartenstein. It seems I'm hoping Isaiah Hartenstein goes to OKC or someplace other than staying in New York, because I think losing Hartenstein, especially with how Mitchell Robinson is hurt every year, that would materially weaken the Knicks as compared to if they were, re-signing OG and they added Mikal Bridges on top of that. So that's something I'm definitely watching out for. Again, not saying that Hartenstein is as good as Mikal Bridges or something, but certainly that would put a dent in the euphoria of adding Mikal Bridges, who obviously like is plug and play, fits beautifully everywhere. But yeah, I mean, I think the consensus probably, if the Sixers fill out their roster like reasonably well with Paul George plus I mean, they signed Eric Gordon, but whatever. Like maybe if they can keep some other pieces, I don't know offhand. We were talking earlier, like something like DeAnthony Melton. I don't know if they can keep Melton in that scenario. Like if they could, that would make me feel materially better about them from their perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think again, like as opposed to last year, I think a lot of people are probably going to be saying the Bucks are fourth, and I'm sure there's going to be some folks saying the Bucks are like fifth or sixth because like, people are going to say like, oh, Indiana's
Cavs kept everybody and Kenny Atkinson's going to get that to work. And
yeah, exactly. And I mean, who knows? I mean, I have no idea.
Too, who beat the Bucks in the first round.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say Pacers, and Cavs, I think will be probably, popular, not the Hawks, definitely not the Hawks. And I'd say the Heat probably at this point also are not going to be looked at as a team. We'll see if Caleb Martin ends up resigning or what happens with him. But, it's definitely been a week of change. And I think with those two teams, they're going to get a lot of headlines. But as we saw last year, right, like the shiny object of like, oh, the Bucks just added Dame Lillard, like, it's going to be so easy, blah, blah, blah. Like, well, we know it's not always so easy. And with Philly, I mean, Paul George is going to turn 35 next year. I think he's aged extremely well, but he certainly doesn't like extend their, contending window given his age. And, you just never know kind of how things are kind of going to work out there. But yeah, I mean, I don't think people were asking like Andre Drummond was this great signing. Like we've already seen this this version of the Sixers with Andre Drummond. Like I don't think that really like, moved the needle previously, but anyway, so anyway, it's it'll be interesting to see, but honestly, like part of me is just like, I'm okay just the Bucks being like a little under the radar.
Yeah.
And like not having expectation, and like looking back last year when the Sixers were, everybody was down on the Sixers because of the Harden stuff coming into the year. And then when the Sixers were good to start the year, everyone was like, oh my God, the Sixers, oh, this is incredible. And the Bucks were like better than them the entire time, but the Bucks, everybody just shit on the Bucks, and, it was like, oh, okay, whatever. And obviously we don't need to relitigate that, but yeah, a part of me was like, you know what, if people just want to like sleep on the Bucks, like for them, that's probably like a better place to be again. And even if it means like finishing fourth, again, I don't want Boston in the second round. I think the place you want to be is second or third. So you at least delay having to potentially play the Celtics until the finals. But yeah, the path is going to be hard, or at least in theory, it's going to be hard. And then we'll see what actually happens, right? With injuries and weird stuff that inevitably happens. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I get it. Probably Bucks fans not overly excited, but I feel like, again, knock on wood, a healthy Giannis in the playoffs, that kind of makes a little bit of difference.
I like my chances against most teams.
Probably be a pretty good thing to have Giannis actually be available.
I'm by no means saying it. Well, the Celtics are bad now and they're not as good, but I'd be very surprised to see where the Celtics finish next year, because it's the year after winning a championship. So have a little less motivation during the regular season, and Kristaps Porzingis is probably going to miss some time as well. So maybe it's the fourth seed.
I feel like that got kind of glossed over. Like it's 5 or 6 months, right? And we're like,
and
now like in July, like that's like that could be the entire rest of the year, right? Like 2 months, the first 2.5 months of the season. Like that's a huge time. And like think about what happened with Rob Williams. Like Rob Williams, it was like, oh, he'll miss the first part of the season. It's like, well, and he was never the same. And KP with foot injuries, leg injuries, like.
And it was initially, when we learned, hey, he's going to have surgery, it was just kind of, kicked under the rug of he's going to have surgery and nothing major. And then all of a sudden, 5 to 6 months. So,
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, and Al Horford is 38 going on 39, I think. And granted, Al, like
they brought back Luke Cornett though. So,
yeah. Well,
so in that situation, maybe it's the Sixers that you're drawing in the second round. The one good piece of news, I think, for the Bucks as it pertains to Philly was seeing KCP go to Orlando, because at one point early on Sunday, there was that Philly's trying to do everything it can to get Paul George and KCP, which would have been even more interesting to to go up against in the East. So that's at least the good part for the Bucks. And the last thing that I have for you, Frank, is
by the way, can we shout out to Bucks ownership? We just sort of take it for granted now, but like,
yeah, that
as of right now, famous last words. Maybe they do some salary dump that hurts the team, blah blah blah. But Denver, like bending over backwards to shed money with the Reggie Jackson trade. Like KCP, like what exactly was the deal with KCP? Like running and hiding from a team where he won a championship, where he's playing with Jokic. Like, should ESPN start asking about Jokic wanting to ask out because the front office can't keep, his supporting cast? Like, whoa, was that? Are we gonna hear that? No, probably not. But that's like, I don't know, like the Cronkies are notoriously
not surprised. You're
not,
right.
yeah. Like, and that to me is, again, like they got cute last year. Well, I don't want to say got cute, but like they lost Bruce Brown. It was like, oh well, like Christian Brown, and like, oh, they'll just draft these second rounders, and like they're so good at developing guys, and Jokic makes everybody looks good. And it's like, well, yeah, where were those guys in the playoffs, right? Christian Brown, I think, who has generally been, solid in the playoffs. Like you look at his numbers though, I think he's like he shot like 20 to 22% from three the last two postseasons, and I'm impressed with his defense, but like, like you lose KCP, you lose Bruce Brown, like you can't just next man up that for the end of time. And when you're expecting like 75% of your like second round draft picks to be like rotation players in the playoffs, like, hey, like Bucks fans can tell you that's a tough road to hoe. Like, well, it may be better at drafting than the Bucks, but like I don't think anybody's that good at drafting that's just like you're just going to be able to stay on that, escalator for the rest of the time.
Well, they're not out of it yet either, because it's going to get even more fascinating, I suppose, for the rest of this offseason, but this full year, because they got to pay Aaron Gordon next year. And, their roster now all of a sudden is the same thing, worse actually, that we said about the Bucks, where it's all these top heavy deals with Jokic. Murray too, another player. They're going to have to pay him next summer. So you got Murray and Gordon that you're going to have to extend. You already extended Michael Porter Jr. I would assume he's being shopped around, but outside of those guys, it's all rookie deals and minimums essentially, with the exception of Zeke Naji, who's there,
who they wish they hadn't, right. whose basic only value is like that he's a mid-tier contract to be traded.
We could throw him into a trade, yeah. So yeah, that's certainly going to be an interesting team to watch here in the next couple weeks, and it will make that series with the Timberwolves last summer this past summer even more interesting. The last thing I was going to mention was I've seen a handful of the business side reporters of the NBA pointing this out, like Bobby Marks, I think, talked about it. Ryan McDonough was saying this on NBA TV and on NBA radio earlier too, that all of these team presidents and owners and GMs and front office people are telling them, man, like this whole second apron thing, like it's ridiculous. All these things we're up against. And I think it was Ryan McDonough who had the analogy of, 3 years ago, you were able to build this mansion, and now 2 years later, the league comes in and says, hey, this house has to come down, is the feeling of it. And you just keep thinking of the I think you should leave meme of like, we're trying to find who did this. Like, you guys signed off on this CBA.
Well, and it's from both sides, right? Like the teams can be looking around being like, what was, the cheap teams, the crappy teams trying to like, come down on and again, it's like, it's kind of funny too, because it's not even like the big market teams at this point. Like the Warriors are trying to get under the tax, not just under the like aprons, but like the tax. The Clippers are basically like, F it, we're done. So like those are kind of like, we're always like the two biggest like targets. So I mean, the second apron won, right? It took like a year, and like those teams have pretty much like thrown in the towel seemingly. But then you're left with like the Bucks just like stiff upper lipping it and paying through the nose in the tax. Again, shout out to the ownership so far, like repeater tax, like nobody's complaining about the repeater tax and how the Bucks can't afford this, in spite of 2 straight first round exits too, right? Like, it's not like they've been like getting like all these playoff gates and things like that to blunt the cost of this team. So I mean,
And
it's
to that point, especially since 3 summers ago, it started with here we go when PJ Tucker left, and it's been anything but.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they've spent at every turn basically, right? Like they carried 15 dudes. Like, it's not like they were like kind of really trying to scrimp on the margins. Like carrying like some of the second round picks, like yeah, that has some
Yeah.
like savings benefits, but whatever. It's not like fans are like pissed off that Chris Livingston exists or something like that. Although sorry to say this, Justin, but I feel like
Oh
if
boy.
they had a chance to like just send Chris Livingston's contract into orbit at this point, they probably would, but I don't
Well,
know.
who would
It's
they
gonna
get for him though?
Well, that's
Still
the
gotta
thing. Like
fill
they
out their
can't.
roster.
I don't know. Like nobody's just gonna probably take his salary at this point. But I don't know.
Well, they're
We can.
crazy if they don't.
Well, it's interesting. Let me. Well, I know we're like way over, but this is the first day of free agency, so the locked on gods can give us some grace. Let me ask you this quick. I'll answer it first. You can take a moment to think about it. Three roster spots open. Give me your ideal use of those 3 roster spots this summer, right? We know it's not going to happen, but like if we could wave our magic wand, and I'm going to use like the list that I had made, right? Like we can't pick guys, like that are clearly out of the budget, but guys that like could reasonably be had for a minimum. I'll start. I think Chris Dunn's probably
Yeah.
like the most
That's
popular,
yeah.
point of attack. Like, yeah, he could be a 5th starter type guy. So I'd say probably put him. I would say probably at the top of the list. And then if I had to pick 2 other guys, I'd probably want one that is more of like a wing, like slightly larger guy. So maybe I would go in that case. I'm going to look at my list again real quick, but maybe I would go with maybe Lonnie Walker at that point. And then again, I think the centerpiece is probably the hardest because I think it's really hard for the Bucks
Yeah.
as long as they have the bigs that they have to like lure somebody. But I think if you gave me the option of adding another big, I might go Precious Achua at this point. He
Yeah.
just had his QO dropped. Again, like he's never really stretched out to be a 3-point shooter the way that kind of people hoped he would. But I think again, just from a defensive versatility standpoint, I think would give the Bucks a different look compared to what they've had with Brook and Bobby. So I don't know, that might be my my list of my ideal 3. If I could bring it up,
Yeah.
anybody different that you would flag?
No, I mean, we're aligned. Chris Dunn would be my number 1. Precious Achua is one I would certainly be interested in. It doesn't make you any younger, but I still think if you could get Nick Batum on a minimum, I would be very interested in that. And the other name that gets kicked around a lot, I think I'm in the I'll believe it when I see it for the minimum is Gary Harris.
Yeah, well, he's obviously surplus to requirements with KCP coming into Orlando. I might actually, for a big man, I might take Xavier Tillman over Precious. I mean, again, not that he was amazing for the Celtics or something like that, but he can
Gives you
hit down
mobility and
yeah, he's like big, beefy, can knock down a 3 at times. So I might put him on the list. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, like lots of other kind of potential guys. It's I think I saw something that like did I see that Dinwiddie might be going back to LA? Dinwiddie's weird because like he's never been an efficient scorer. His 3-point percentage is never as high as you want it to be. But his kind of like peripheral stuff, like his kind of like on-court, off-court impact stuff is always pretty good. And I don't know. I think he's like 31. I don't know. Like again, part of me also just kind of wonders like if you add like a very much like a defensive oriented guard, right? Like Pat Bev is kind of like the default there, but like Chris Dunn and DSJ, like Dennis Smith Jr., like they're also not like creators on the ball really per se. So I do kind of wonder, that is something that clearly, especially when Dame was hurt, they really missed, right? Having a guy at the backup point guard that could actually do some of that. So I kind of wonder, like, if you said Chris Dunn was your 5th starter, yeah, he can bring the ball up. He was previously a point guard in a former life. But, would you want to add somebody that is ostensibly more of a, offensive initiator type guy, so you're not just solely relying on Dame, but I don't know. Yeah. Shout us out. Shout out in the YouTube comments / and Twitter who your ideal 3 would be. If it doesn't depress you too much.
Yeah, it's going to end up being Pat Beverly, Jay Crowder, and Seth Curry are the 3. Well, I suppose we'll continue to wait on the Paul George news, but unfortunately, it looks like he's headed to Philly, and it's going to be an interesting offseason for the Bucks for all the reasons that we laid out here. I suppose we didn't really provide a definitive answer on, do the Bucks have to move Brook? Like, is that really the only bullet that you have left to play here? And that's the tough part about the offseason for everything that we went through of maybe, but like to that last point that you made about the ownership paying the tax, habitually paying the tax, and this team just kind of sticking with the, nah, we're going to keep it together as best we can, and we think if we're healthy, we'll break through. That's the other tough part about it is I don't know about taking a step back because, to your point of it's definitely taken a step back in the regular season, the absence of a Brook type. There's definitely a value add in the postseason, but as we just mentioned with those teams getting better around you, like, are you looking at a scenario as crazy as it is to suggest if you make a move like that and it's even more tinkering of like, man, they could be a play-in tournament team next year?
I'm not emotionally ready to grapple with that yet, Justin. So let's just put a pin in that one for now. Let's let free agency marinate a little bit. Cross our fingers for Chris Dunn and some of these. Again, it's kind of sad that Chris Dunn is like this dream target, but it is what
Bucks
it is.
fans are viewing Chris Dunn like the Sixers fans are viewing Paul George.
Hey, we've already got all our kind of big ticket guys. Like we don't need Paul George, Justin. Like we can focus on more modest things. We've got our young developmental stars that we can watch in summer league that are going to eventually be the next phase of Bucks contention, lead the next phase of Bucks contention with Giannis. Like we're going glass half full today. It's the first day of free agency.
I mean, I won't end on that note. I was going to say, since we ended on the man, this is what we're left with. It reminded me of a conversation I had in the spring before one of those first round games. And I won't name who it was with, but they had said, you remember when the playoffs were fun?
Giannis got through an exhibition, 15 minutes of exhibition basketball this week. So shout out to him for that. He's only got to get through the summer and 82 games. And then hopefully we can get used to seeing Giannis wearing a tank top and basketball shorts rather than, a hoodie and street clothes in the playoffs again. Wouldn't that be nice?
It seems like a good spot to wrap it up there. We'll keep our eyes open for obviously the Paul George news, because that seems like that's going to be the big domino for everything else to start to trickle out, and maybe some trades to start to happen once Philly or any other team knows what they have there and what they can do. So we'll be back once again tomorrow with, I'm assuming, the fallout from possibly a Paul George signing and any other moves that we've seen made by Eastern Conference teams. For Frank, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.